Tonight, though, I am absolutely delighted to have Laurie Santos with us here. I would say that we have been looking forward to this in my family longer than any other speaker that we've brought to campus, because my wife, turns out, is a huge fan of Laurie's. I am clearly second most favorite psychology professor in my house, and she is watching from home tonight. My daughter also got a chance, Sion got a chance to meet Laurie a little while ago, and also is smitten with her, and you'll find out why here in just a little bit, I'm sure. So Laurie is a professor of psychology and the head of Silliman College at Yale University, when she's not on leave, which she is this year. She started her PhD career at Harvard University, where I was on the faculty at the time too. That was where I first met Laurie. And she started in a place that bears little relation to where she is right now. She started studying primate cognition, the evolutionary origins of human thought. She since, though, has shifted her focus a little bit to try to convey some of the basic findings from behavioral science in ways that she thinks will matter to people. She has become the world's best purveyor of behavioral science research to the public on happiness and well-being. She teaches a course at Yale that turns out to be the most popular in its 300-year history. I guess they give students surveys or something for this, called Psychology and the Good Life, which teaches students the what behavioral science suggests people can do to make wiser choices, live a life that's happier and more fulfilling. She's also turned this class into a Coursera course that is free. My bet is many of you in this room have taken it. How many of you? There we go. All of you know Laurie very well. You, along with 3.3 million other people who have also taken her class, which is just stunning. She also hosts an amazing podcast called The Happiness Lab, which if you haven't heard of it or been a regular listener, that needs to change. She is in her 5th season of doing that, which I think is pretty amazing. Plus, Laurie has also done an ad for Chanel, which really is the litmus test for whether you have arrived as a faculty member or not. There are lots of professors in this room tonight. There's not one other professor here, as far as I know, that has also done an ad for Chanel. Am I right on that? Yeah.
And show of hands.
Yeah. All right, so Laurie, thank you so much for being here with us tonight. I want to start our conversation. I should say before we start that we gathered a lot of questions from you when you registered. I'm going to be weaving those questions into our conversation here tonight. We're also going to try to run you through some demonstrations that Laurie suggested might be good experiences for you to have that we worked up a bit together. But before we get to that, I actually want to start with you being here, which, 15, 20 years ago? I don't think anybody would have ever guessed that you would be here doing what you are doing now. You started out working with Mark Hauser, studying primate cognition. You were studying monkey thinking for a long time, and now you're not as much.
As much.
How did that shift happen?
Yeah.
How did you come through that journey?
Yeah. So I think even though I was studying monkeys, what I was really broadly interested in were sort of the quirks of the human mind, right? The errors, the mistaken intuitions we have about how we think, about how we make decisions, and so on. And I was studying that through a lens of trying to understand what makes us unique, where we kind of uniquely go astray. But that was, my day job. I was a comparative cognition researcher for a while, and that changed when I took on this new role on Yale's campus when I became a head of college on campus. So Yale's one of these weirdo schools like Hogwarts and Harry Potter, where there's like colleges within a college, like Gryffindor, Slytherin kind of thing. I'm head of Silliman, and that means I live on campus with students. Like I eat with them in the dining hall and hang out with them in the coffee shop. And I was expecting college life to be a lot like it was when I was in college. But that wasn't really what I was seeing. I was seeing this so-called mental health crisis up close and personal, where like nationally right now, over 40% of college students report being too depressed to function most days. Over 60% of college students report being overwhelmingly anxious. Another over 60% report feeling very lonely most of the time. And 1 in 10 college students has seriously considered suicide in the last year, right? These are the national statistics, not just Yale. And I was just seeing this up close and personal, and just had this realization of like, I think I'm teaching them stuff in my class about evolution or psychology or computer science or whatever, and I'm like, they're not retaining any of this stuff with mental health statistics that are that prevalent on campus. And so I just felt this kind of like compelling urge to be like, somebody needs to do something about this. And I also felt like our field has some tips, right? We have some insights about this doesn't have to be that way, right? There's skills you can learn to do better at this. And so I said, all right, if no one else in my department is, putting this together, I'll develop this new class on this stuff. I kind of retrained a little bit in positive psychology, kind of took a year to kind of learn all this stuff, and develop this class. And you kind of heard the epilogue version, over 1,000 students on campus took it. A quarter of the entire campus enrolled the first semester, which was a logistical nightmare. You don't want to teach a quarter of the students.
I'm imagining the grading.
It's like,
Holy cow.
27
no assignments.
teaching fellows, 27 teaching fellows, so it was kind of a mess, but it really struck this chord where, we just got a ton of press of people saying, these 19-year-old Ivy League students who in theory have made it, and a quarter of the campus needs these tips on happiness. Kind of what about the rest of us? And in doing that, I just realized there was just this real need, and sometimes I get frustrated with our field of psychology where we have these real insights about behavioral science that we know and we publish in like PNAS or like JEP General, but we're not like getting them out there to the rest of the world. And so teaching the class, and then because of the class having this opportunity to put the class online and do this podcast, made me realize that like we need to get better about translating some of this stuff. And I sort of didn't ask for the platform to be the person who was doing that translation, but it sort of wound up in my lap. And so I'm like, all right, let me just do the best job I can with that.
Yeah. So I think what's impressive about it, from my perspective, is that lots of folks kind of see where there's a need. You can, but it can be hard to grab that. To say, no, I'm going to do that. I'm going to take that on. And you did that. That had to be hard.
I think there were a few interesting things that were hard about it, right? One is this, sense of, I think, for the students out there, like a little bit of imposter syndrome, right? Especially as a person who came from comparative cognition, right? Like, can I talk about this stuff in happiness and positive psychology? But I realized, like, no, I'm like a researcher, like I can learn this stuff as well as other people. I think also it was helpful to come from the outside because it allows me to give voices to people like you, to other people in this room and say, hey, let me let them present their work. And the podcast is a great medium for that because like literally I can have someone talk about this on the podcast. So, but it's amazing, right? It has a tremendous impact, right? You're talking to millions of people. I mean, maybe it was just like primate cognition, but if like 30 people read my paper, it was like, yeah, yes, success, like Mrs. Worldwide, this is great. But when you're presenting things in a popular medium, like a podcast, or putting these things out, digitally, you can just reach so many more people, and that part has felt amazing.
Yeah. All right, well, let's start at the foundation. Unquestionably, the most common question we got from folks who had registered was, what is happiness anyway?
Yeah.
Is it a single thing? Is it a lot of things? Is it just feeling good? Is it something else?
Yeah.
Help us think about this.
Yeah, there could be lots of definitions of these. I mean, we could have a whole semester-long course debating this kind of thing. I steal a common social science definition of happiness. It's one that researcher Sonia Lyubomirsky uses a lot, where she says that thinking about happiness, we need to think about it as being happy in your life and happy with your life. What does she mean by that? Happy in your life is the construct of your kind of emotional well-being. It's the ratio of positive to negative emotions you have. It's not having no negative emotions, as we'll see in a second, but it's kind of having that ratio feel pretty good. That's like feeling happy in your life. But being happy with your life is really your answer to the question, all things considered, how satisfied are you with your life? It's a construct that's tapping into your sense of meaning, your sense of purpose, right? And I like that construct because you can see that those two parts can sometimes be in conflict. I have a friend at home who just had a newborn baby. I think that's a time for those parents out there who like your sense of meaning in life, very high. Your day-to-day happiness, just sleep reduction, very low. There's like conflict. And I think, those of you who are in business school who will go out to work with the rich and powerful and wealthy, like you can see the construct flipped, right? Where you have every hedonic happiness. You could buy every single hedonic happiness, the best wine, first class or whatever, but you have this deep sense that something meaningful is lacking. And so the kinds of interventions I like are the ones that happen to boost both of those. And in fact, interestingly, a lot of the interventions we'll talk about do the work of both. They kind of make you feel happy in the moment, and they give you a sense of deeper purpose and meaning in a longer term. So yeah, so that was, we could debate a lot about the definition, but that's the one I'm assuming we're talking about.
Yeah, okay. So one of the things you come back to over and over again in your podcast that many will have heard here is that happiness doesn't always come from the sources that we think it does on either dimension. It can come from surprising sources. But sometimes it comes from not so surprising sources. And one of the not so surprising sources that folks talk a lot about is money.
Yep.
So let's start with that, where the field is now on what money does for happiness. And I want to paraphrase a question from one of the folks in the room, I think here tonight, Paula Geen, who may be with us, who asked, research says that supposedly people who make a lot of money aren't necessarily happier than people who make 80 or 90,000 a year. I'll paraphrase here a little bit, but as someone who has experienced many economic levels from poverty to making more than that threshold, I can attest to being much happier with more money even above that threshold. So apparently the research is all wrong, right? She asked, what do you think this research is actually trying to tell us?
Yeah, so I think this question of money and happiness is really, it depends, right? I think our intuition is that more is always going to be better. And depending where you are on your, the income spectrum, more might be a lot better, right? If you're living below the poverty line, if you can't put food on your table, if your subsistence needs aren't being met, yes, getting more money would be great. I think we should all fight for universal income, et cetera, et cetera. Yes, we need to solve things at the lower levels of income. But the data really suggests that once you hit a level where that's not the case anymore, and we can debate what that level is, in 2010, when Kahneman and Deaton did their famous paper on this, they were saying that it's about $75,000. In dollars today, maybe we're like $90,000. There's probably some wiggle room there. But the claim is that there's a threshold at which that slope that was going up very fast, like when you're in poverty, levels off. And I think the debate is does it level off perfectly? Does it level off mostly? Whereas if you run it out to infinity, maybe you get a teeny bit of a bump up. I think that's kind of the debate. But the intuition it's violating is I think most of us walk around with an intuition that the slope keeps going up and that it doesn't really flatten that much. That most of you think that if we quintupled your income tomorrow, you would have a measurable difference in happiness, and it would be a lasting measurable difference in happiness. And my sense is that the data just don't hold that up. There was a recent paper by Matt Killingsworth that kind of did this detailed reanalysis, and he finds when he log transforms income and he looks at people who are making really ridiculous amounts of money that yes, it goes up. But I put Matt's data on the scale when you look at other interventions like meditating, writing in a gratitude journal. And yes, you can go up to $7 million and you'll get the benefit of doing 5 minutes of meditation every day or writing in your gratitude journal twice a week, right? And so I guess yes, it might go up a little bit, but it doesn't go up in the way we expect. Or a better way to put it is framing your life around getting money is going to be a fool's errand and is an opportunity cost on putting time into the stuff that might work better.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's talk about what some of that stuff that might work better is.
Yeah.
In particular, the stuff that's maybe surprisingly better.
Yeah. Well, one of the surprises, which shouldn't be a surprise for anyone here, because you have Nick, here with you, is the incredible power of social connection. And again, all the stuff we're going to say when we give some of these tips that work, you might be like, well, I kind of knew that. I knew that talking to people helps. But I like to say it's common wisdom, but it's not common practice. My guess is that many of you have been in a situation that had other people around you, where instead of talking to those living, breathing, in real life humans that could give you a positive emotion boost, you picked up your phone and were looking at that instead, or looking at a screen, or just looking off and not connecting with these people around you. But the data suggests, Nick's data in fact suggests, that you do that at a cost to your emotional health, an opportunity cost to your emotional health. We predict that being kind of in our own brains, in our space, not going through the awkward phase of talking with someone we don't know is probably going to feel better than making the attempt to talk to them. But so much data suggests that we're wrong. And I think we're going to prove that, not prove it today, or at least demonstrate that today.
Another way to maybe think about this is that it's common wisdom, but not common wisdom when you are practicing it.
Yes.
Right, so we kind of abstractly recognize this is good, but when there's somebody standing in front of me in line, you might not feel at that moment that person is worth talking to.
My favorite, I can't remember if I told you this example. My favorite example of this was that I was on a plane. So I know this stuff. One of the themes that you'll hear is that I know this work very well, but I have a really hard time practicing it myself. And this, I think, is true of all of us, right? Our intuitions are this is not going to be fun. So I know this work. I've had Nick on the podcast, read all Nick's papers on a plane, get an email, because I'm already on the screen on the plane. I'm not talking to the person next to me. Get an email from a fan of the show who's like, oh my gosh, I just have to tell you my experience that I listened to your show with Nick Epley. And I was on a plane, and I was like, you know what, I'm supposed to talk to the person next to me, but I'm so scared, but I'm just going to do it. And I started talking to the person next to me, and it turns out we have friends in common and family. We just talked for the rest of this 7-hour flight to California. And then I left, and we were going to go together, and it was dark, and so he walked me to my car, and then it turned out my battery was dead, and so he drove me back, and he helped me out of this situation, and I got to know him, and we went to dinner, and thank you so much, thank you. And at this moment of looking at the dude next to me, I just spent 4 hours of not talking to you, okay, fine, I'll talk to him, and then it was fine, right? So yes, common wisdom, but not common wisdom when we should be practicing it, when we have the moment to practice. Yeah.
All right, so let's practice a bit.
Yeah.
Okay, so do you want to introduce us?
Yeah, well, it's your intervention, so I'll have you. One thing is that hopefully some of you are sitting there, people you know, but ideally you're going to talk to the person on the side of you that you don't know as well. Already the faces are showing.
Yeah, already you're ready to leave. You didn't know this was part of the price of admission here tonight. You thought it was just free beer. No.
And we're going to make it easy for you because we're going to give you a prompt. You're going to have an assignment, so you don't have to think of what to say to these folks. We're going to hit on a different thing that might make you feel better. We want you to talk to the person next to you about one thing that you're really deeply grateful for. Ideally something you don't think about a lot, but something you're really grateful for. We'll just let you do it. Again, ideally the person that you don't know as super well next to you, both share what you're grateful for. And we'll
think of that thing and then turn to somebody and share it.
I'm never going to.
Okay, kids. All right, calm down, everybody, calm down. This is always the experience I have when I let my students go and talk. They barely bring them back. All right, so you get the idea there a little bit,
Well,
right?
it's worth doing especially those of you who are you're gonna have to talk to somebody, and whether you externally showed the, or internally a little felt the, does it feel like that now? No, you're all kind of beaming, right? But again, now we have to put that into practice and another opportunity for that, and overcome all the costs of
And not necessarily with just the person you learned was pretty decent just a moment ago.
Yes, exactly.
They're new people just as decent as the person you just talked to a moment ago. All right, so social connection is powerful, and it often is surprisingly powerful, it seems. What's another one? Let's talk about behaviors a little bit. What specific actions can we take, things can we do?
Yeah, some are incredibly simple, again, grandmotherly wisdom, just specific healthy things like sleep and exercise. And again, we know this, but what happens is when, at least if your life is like mine, when push comes to shove and things get really busy, those are the first things that go. Right? At the time when you need them most, you sleep less, and you probably hit the gym a little bit less, or whatever your form of moving your body happens to look like. And so those are ones that we need to kind of get in our brain, that we need to sort of double down on. Another doing one, which is also kind of reflects some of your work as well, is kind of engaging socially in terms of how you spend your money, right? Pro-social donation. One of the reasons money doesn't make us happy is we tend to spend it on ourselves, but if we spent more of that money on other people, doing nice things for others, but also using money to connect with others experientially, we'd probably be a little happier.
Okay. And how about mindsets?
Yeah, so when sometimes one of the frameworks I give students when we're thinking about what you could do to feel happier, I sometimes steal from a cognitive behavior therapy, like a CPT kind of framework. Sometimes I say CPT, I say CBD. I'm no.
Yeah,
different That's
a different happiness-inducing
different behavior. No, but the CPT approach, which is you want to think in terms of changing your cognition, changing your actual thinking, and also changing your behavior. They have this kind of cognitive triad of thinking, behaving, and emotions. And so you can kind of think about intervening on each of those. So when you think about intervening on our mindsets, we're kind of intervening on how we're thinking. And that, you kind of engaged in that a little bit, right? Just by kind of noticing what you're grateful for, noticing the good things, noticing the lights. And that takes a shift in thinking. It takes a shift in attention, right? Our psychology, vision science researchers are going to just think about how focused attention is and how we don't often build it out. What you have to do to notice the good things and notice what you're grateful for is actually shift your attention a little bit. I think it also takes a mindset of compassion, which is something that, hardcore, like academics and business students like yourself have a tough time with, right? I think one of our main bad intuitions is we have intuitions about how human motivation works, but a lot of those intuitions are wrong. We think if I just scream at myself like a horrible drill sergeant and speak to myself like I would get fired for speaking to one of my colleagues in public, then I will be motivated and get stuff done. And it turns out, not so surprisingly from work like folks like Kristen Neff and others, that just doesn't work, that a better way of talking to yourself is talking to yourself like you would a friend. The framework she talks about is sort of self-compassion, which she thinks about is kind of noticing what's going on, kind of being mindful about what's going on, recognizing that you're just a human. She talks about common humanity, like you're just like a normal person. And then she says, treat yourself with some kindness like you treat your friend. And I think it's the treat yourself like you treat your friend is important, because I sometimes think when we think of being nice to ourselves and in our self-talk, we assume that means kind of being self-indulgent or like just letting ourselves off when we really kind of need to get called out a little bit. And the thing is, you wouldn't do that to your best friend, right? Like if your best friend was really messing up, you wouldn't be like, you're a jerk and you suck and why do you keep doing it? Like you wouldn't be mean to them, but you might be like, it's been tough, but maybe those decisions you've been making aren't perfect. Like what's going on, right? Let's get curious about what happened and figure it out, right? So if we can bring that attention to ourselves, and this is a process of self-compassion, that can be, the data suggests, incredibly powerful for our well-being, but also makes you procrastinate less, and it actually makes you a more compassionate person to other people, which is quite powerful too.
So do we want to try to demonstrate one of these?
Yeah.
Either a behavior or a mindset shift.
Yeah, so let's try out a little compassion just to see, because they're kind of metrics you can do to do this. Do we want to do a little fast meditation? We said we weren't going to do the meditation, but I got off track, so we'll do the meditation.
Okay.
Okay, because this is also...
I knew we were going to meditation eventually.
Good. It's good. You're always going to get there.
It's just going to happen.
Okay, so this is like the opposite of the kind of social connection, which is the boisterous one. We're going to go inward for a second. So if you're comfortable with it, maybe close your eyes, and if for some reason you're not comfortable with it, that's cool, but just kind of fixate on a point up there and just notice what's happening. We're going to engage in another behavior that can help with happiness, which is just to take a really deep breath, slow, deep breath. You're hacking your sympathetic nervous system right now and kind of turning on your rest and digest system. So big, deep breath. I want you to pick someone in your life who's really easy to love, really easy to show compassion to. It's okay if it's a pet. Sometimes the pets are up there. But picture this individual, this animal, and just notice the feelings you have toward it, the protective feelings you have. And I want you, in your head, to kind of give some compassion to this individual. This is what's known as a loving kindness practice. I want you to say in your head to this individual, may you be happy. May you be safe. May you care for yourself joyfully. Kind of keep repeating those phrases. May you be happy. May you be safe. May you care for yourself joyfully. If you can, kind of notice how your body feels. Sometimes people self-report like a warm feeling in their chest, or just kind of noticing a sense of peace or like a sense of love. It's okay if you don't feel that too. It kind of takes a while to get there, but just notice. And then we're going to shift from this person who's really easy to love, and we're going to switch to someone that can be hard to love. We're going to switch to ourselves. I want you to think of yourself in all your good traits and all your faults. And you're going to do that same set of phrases for yourself. May I be happy. I be safe. May I care for myself joyfully. Notice if that one feels different, feels harder. It's okay either way, no judgment. Just kind of go through. May I be happy. May I be safe. May I care for myself joyfully. After you take a second to notice how it feels, kind of come back to your breath, flutter your eyes open. It's easier to get people back than
It is. I'm not coming back,
You're not
though.
coming
I'm ready
back,
for a
yeah.
nap. I'm looking
But-
at my booth colleagues. We're starting our
Yeah.
faculty meetings this
Yeah.
way,
I once
starting next week.
I once spoke to a group of incredibly intense Hollywood talent agents. Think the people
course
that
you did.
destroy people's careers and stuff like this. And I had a group of 100 of them do this exercise, and I made them do it for like 15 minutes of and I did a different hard one, which is pick somebody you really don't like someone you have true animosity for, and do that. And it was like when the eyes flittered open, I was like, we've completely changed the culture of Hollywood. This very strange, very strange. But yeah, but it's a powerful exercise, and I think it's worth, if you're a person, and I put myself in this category, who had a little trouble with the self one, that's okay. It's something to notice and something to work on. But if you can switch that and treat yourself like you want to give compassion to the other individual, if you kind of treat yourself like that, huge wins both for your well-being and your performance.
All right, so the key to doing this seems to be making these practices that you do routinely, right? All of these things are things that you could do like exercise, and that we probably do as often as we actually exercise, which is to say probably not enough.
Yep.
So we'll come back to thinking about how we do that a little better, put it into practice. We've just spent some time trying to make ourselves a little bit happier here, and one of our grad students here, Alejandra Chavarria, noted that these all sound straightforward to some extent, but they're hard to put them into practice. So we know, Alejandra said, that science tells us that doing many things is good for overall happiness, keeping a gratitude journal, working out, staying away from social media. But why is it so hard to follow this advice if you know that the result will be beneficial in your life? How can I start doing what science tells us will make me happier?
I don't know. This one's hard to be. This is why good grad students.
You don't do this every morning? You start with the loving kindness meditation?
There's some mornings where it works out. I'll say I'm much better at this stuff than before I started studying it, but it'll still a slog for me, and I still mess up a lot, and it still is work, and it doesn't feel like it's my intuition. This kind of gets back to my old evolutionary roots. This is a really stupid feature of human nature, I think, of the human mind, which is like, we have these things that are rewarding, but those things don't necessarily map onto the things that we're motivated to go after, that we crave, right? There's certain rewarding things that hack the motivation system fast, like true dopamine hits. Like if I had a hit of cocaine, a delicious, boost of sugary, fatty thing, that goes there fast, and I have strong motivation, built-in motivational systems to get me to go after that. But that calm feeling of loving kindness that you just experienced, it's not tapping into the motivation system the same way. I think if we could just get motivation to correctly map onto all the things that were rewarding, that would be great. That would mean I wouldn't go after stuff that was very motivating, but probably ultimately not that rewarding, like picking up my phone when I'm in the line or checking my email when I could be talking to somebody. That would make me better. And if I could have not the very system two-y, very forced action to try to talk to someone, if it just came easily, if it was my natural inclination, that would be better. But sadly, brains not designed like that. Sucks. I did not get consulted on this.
No neurosurgery that you would recommend?
I don't know. Well, for MBAs, challenge for MBAs, and maybe neuroscientists out there too, if we can get a way to pull those things together better, you will make tons of money. That's the way, and you'll make tons of friends, which is really what the thing. You will solve a lot of human angst, right? Because I think the angst is about I know what I'm supposed to be doing, but it's really hard to put it into practice. Behavior change is really hard. And I think it's just a feature of the system. But there are hacks you can use. You can use, and these hacks are ancient. These are hacks that Aristotle talked about back in the day. You can use social support. You can try to, just commit to meditating with a friend, or kind of get other people to help you out. If you have kids in the audience, a lot of people who've watched my class watch it with their kids, and they say their kids are great social supports for getting you to do stuff, because as soon as the kids see you doing something that you don't, they're like, Mom, you just said you're not gonna go on social media, whatever, right? So harness the kids. But another practice that there's some hints can kind of hack this motivation reward thing is trying to be a little bit more mindful. Some work by folks like Hedy Kober at Yale suggests, especially in the kind of craving domain, when you really get the sort of, with drugs of addiction and things, if you deeply pay attention to how rewarding these things are when you engage with them, you can sometimes like hack the craving, which is this motivational system, a little bit. And so I think after, for example, doing the social practice that we just did, I had you all stop and notice, like, hey, notice what you predicted, and notice how it really felt. After you did the loving kindness meditation, what did that feel like? Like you felt better talking to yourself like that. And so that moment of mindfulness doesn't fully turn it into a dopamine hit like cocaine that your system would immediately engage with and want to learn from, but it can help get us on the path. But ultimately, very hard. I hope one of you, much smarter than me, will sort this out. So behavior change will be easy and everyone will live the way they know they should be living.
One of the big challenges, it seems, is that ideally you would just turn these into habits, just things that you did, just, right? Super simple, but it takes a very long time to create a habit.
A long time. Habits, again, I would design a system. So a habit's very easy, but if you can kind of force yourself to do these things over time, it helps. I mean, this is what Aristotle thought. Aristotle thought, first of all, he thought that virtue was not like you just were really good at virtue. You're just a really good self-regulator. You're just really good at meditating every morning. He thought, no, you're very good at hacking yourself to do these habits over time. And one of the hacks can really be other people. Surround yourself with people that are doing it, and naturally you'll kind of do it a little more.
All right, so we're here talking about happiness this evening, surrounded by a world that seems on fire in lots of ways, both literally and figuratively.
Yep.
And, we got social unrest, we got misinformation, threats to democracy, war in Ukraine, mass migration. List another 10 of your favorite looming threats in the world. Should we be bothering with this?
Yeah.
This feels, is this self-indulgent or shallow to be thinking about pursuing happiness when there's a lot of other stuff that needs active pursuit?
Yeah, this, as you might imagine, is a question I get a lot, especially from my students, who I think, perhaps in a better way, more so than faculty, are acutely aware that they're growing up in a world that feels like it's on fire, right? But here I think the social science gives us some hints, right? So you could assume that the mind worked like this, that a focus on your own happiness made you complacent. Call it like a polyandrous syndrome, where it's like, I did my loving kindness meditation, so I'm good, war in Ukraine, like I'm good, like social unrest, I'm good, anti-black violence, like just ignore it, I'm fine, right? That's how the mind could work. But we can ask, does the mind work like this? And this is what Costa Kushlev at Georgetown, a former student of Liz Dunn, has done a lot, to ask, if people are good in terms of their emotions, right? If they self-report having a life that they're satisfied with, if they self-report having lots of positive emotions, what does that do to the extent to which they really take action on causes they care about? And he's looked specifically at social justice actions, for example, going to a Black Lives Matter protest, donating money. He's also done this in the climate context. He surveys people about what are your climate anxieties? How worried are you about climate change? But also did you do something? Did you install solar panels? Did you write to your congressman or whatever? And what he finds is that anxiety goes up and your worries about these things goes up as your negative emotions goes up, which makes sense. If you're generally anxious about lots of stuff, you're gonna probably be anxious about climate change too. But what he finds is if you look at the way people act, again, you go to a protest, you donate, you do something, what he finds is that that is correlated with your level of well-being. In other words, you're more likely to take action if you feel good. And again, we kind of know that. There's put your own oxygen mask on first, right? These are activists talk about quotes like this. Audre Lorde is a quote of self-care is a political act, to kind of paraphrase probably quite badly on the spot. But the key is that your happiness isn't just this selfish thing. Ultimately, when you are in a good place yourself, it gives you the bandwidth to take action. And honestly, it was actually I remember reading a paper of Kushlev's right as I was kind of teaching some of these class, and I thought my gosh, this generation, those statistics I was just telling you about, where 40% of students are too depressed to function, is 60% are overwhelmingly anxious. Me and Nick's generation are leaving this messed up on fire world to them, and we haven't given them the emotional tools to be able to solve it. It seems like one of those emotional tools is taking care of yourself. And so I think if you're the kind of person who's how can I focus on myself and engage in these habits and put time into this, again, at an opportunity cost of whatever social justice cause I care about, remember, they're not in conflict. They're really in harmony. You get more bandwidth to fix this stuff if you focus on yourself. So
now, one of the findings that emerges in this literature is that the stuff that leads to happiness also tends to lead to energy.
Exactly,
To get you aroused and make you more approach-oriented, where fear is avoidance-oriented.
And Liz Dunn, if you're interested, if I could plug one thing, Liz Dunn has this lovely website called Happy Climate. I think it's happyclimate.org, where she talks about, look, I'm going to go through a list of things you can do to be happier. Like talk to somebody and carpool with them. Like, spend money in this way, do X, Y, and Z. And she's like, if you look at them, they're also exactly the things that help with climate change. So you can hack your climate worries and hack your happiness at the same time. It didn't have to be the fact that they didn't have to line up like that, but they kind of do, which is great. So you can do both.
All right, that's why I take the train.
Yes, exactly.
All right. So in a related vein, we have some cynicism out here.
Please, yeah.
Judith Gregory, one of our online attendees watching over Zoom tonight, asked, "Is happiness overrated? Should it be the goal of our actions? Should we be pursuing happiness?" Another online student, Sundar Vivek, simply asked, "Is being happy overrated? Many times we see self-happiness being used as an excuse for selfishness at the expense of others."
Yeah.
So should we be pursuing happiness directly?
Yeah, I think, first of all, you only get these kind of questions at a business school. It's always very fun. It's like, happiness, money, not overrated at all, go for money, no. No, I mean, I think part of the issue is that we get happiness wrong, right? We assume that happiness is, self, it's self-care, it's achieving my accolades, it's having everything in life work out for me, right? And sometimes we think the pursuit of it is going after that stuff. But when you engage in the pursuit that we're talking about, right, which is like about connecting with other people, it's about developing community, it's about developing meaning, there's not as much of the conflict as you think, right? I think a second mistaken intuition that we have is that happiness is like happy all the time. It's like that Pharrell video from 10 years ago where there's smiling emojis and yes, we're happy. It's no negative emotion, nothing ever goes bad in your life, there's no challenge or conflict, right? And that's just not what the data suggests, right? I mean, some of the things that people report gaining the most happiness and the most connection from are often awful circumstances in their lives, things that are incredibly challenging, where you come out the other side feeling better. And I think this idea that to be happy all the time means we need to get rid of negative emotions completely is just wrong. First of all, it's just a bad idea. Negative emotions are there as a good signal for what you're supposed to be paying attention to make positive changes in your life. And that means we need to kind of allow them and respect them. The happy path of dealing with negative emotions is a path of radical acceptance, which is kind of what DBT researchers talk about a lot, right? So it's not shunning them or squashing them down, which there's so much evidence in emotion regulation that it just kind of doesn't work. It's allowing them and being with them and learning from them and so on. So I think part of it's that we have a mistaken notion of how we get to happiness, and part of it is a mistaken notion about what happiness is. But when you realize that getting to happiness is all these good things in life, and that happiness isn't smiling emojis all the time, it's embracing the complexity and the interestingness of our emotional lives, you don't worry as much.
There's a common saying that I like, that the best way to have a good day is to make sure someone else has one, which I think sums up a lot of the at least one big aspect of the positive activity interventions. Exercise and sleep and those things are more self-oriented, but there's a big class of them that are oriented towards attending less to yourself and attending towards benefiting another person.
And the irony, I think, is also, this is also true in the loneliness literature. I think if you're feeling lonely, one way to get out of that is to try to make someone else feel less lonely, is to reach out and really try to help and connect with someone else. And so, yeah, I think ultimately, if you're doing it right, happiness it's not like bubble baths and buying a nice gratitude journal or something. Not that I'm against gratitude journal, but it's a different thing than we think it is. But if you're going after the right thing, the thing that the empirical research says is really going to work, then there's not as much of a conflict.
Yeah. All right. So another question is whether happiness is always possible. That is, life throws us lots of curveballs, gives us serious scars. Trauma is a real part of life, and if you live long enough, you'll get hit with it. So one of our Zoom attendees noted that the loss of a child is the greatest source of grief and sorrow a parent can experience. Life goes on, but can it be happy? What do you think the research tells us about well-being in cases of trauma like this? Is happiness possible?
Yeah. Again, it's not to denounce the trauma and the grief that come from something like that, right? The negative emotion that comes from awful events is real. But when you interview people who've gone through these terrible things, what you often hear is that more good than bad came from it. Not I would go through it again, or I'm embracing it or whatever, but I've learned something and come out on the other side. And this is what a lot of researchers talk about when they talk about what's called post-traumatic growth. This idea that we all think about post-traumatic stress, but there's evidence that trauma can actually make you grow. Grow how? One is that you often, out of some traumas, especially if you connect with people, get more social connection. That second part of life of like, all things considered, I'm satisfied with my life, you often get a lot of a sense of purpose and meaning. You know what matters. And I think you kind of recalibrate. This is a department who cares, or Chicago is a place where people care a lot about framing and these kinds of behavioral hacks. Like when you go through something really terrible, it reframes all the BS in life. That traffic is not as bad when you're dealing with like terminal cancer, right? And that's powerful, right? That changes things. And so I think our assumption is none of us would choose to go through the bad stuff. But in practice, some of the bad stuff can allow us to have a certain kind of growth. Again, not one that we'd chosen, but one that we learn from. The second thing is to just say that like, this is life, right? Like those negative emotions are part and parcel of a complex like emotional life. And so when you can allow them and get curious about them, if you're constantly trying to squash them down and be like happy emoji all the time, it's not gonna work. But if you can find a way to sort of embrace them a little bit and get curious about them and get curious what you can learn about them, you can find a way to be with them. I think a lot of the problem that comes from grief and these terrible emotions is we want them to be over with a lot. We hate them. We're like, go away. And we engage in a process with our emotions that I like to liken to like, if you have a beach ball and you're like at a pool, like you're squishing the beach ball down into the water. And you can like hold it down, but it's like taking a lot of emotional work and eventually it's gonna like fly out. And I think this is what we think we should do with any bad thing that happens. And the evidence is just like it doesn't, just like the beach ball, it's gonna fly out and hit somebody in the face, like your emotions are gonna fly out and probably hit somebody in the face, right? Whereas if you can just kind of be with them, it's kind of not that bad. And so I think the evidence really suggests that circumstances that are truly awful don't always lead to a lack of joy forever. And that there's something important psychologically to be learned from these moments. And if we can be a little curious and open to it, it doesn't make it great, but it allows us to kind of have some important growth on the other side.
Have some purpose from it. Yeah, and often people who are in the midst of trauma don't want it to go away. You lose a child, you don't want to stop feeling that. That's not... Totally.
And I think that within, I think we also have this intuition that emotions are like good or bad. It's like, but that grief can be interestingly bittersweet, right? It's awful, but there's some sweetness in there. There are memories that you get to cherish. There are ways that you can kind of go back. And so I think don't feel like it has to be one or another. It's okay to embrace kind of the good parts of the awful things.
I heard this phrase a while ago about the importance of wearing your scar as a badge rather than hiding it away. The idea being that you can find meaning in these events that help you help others and become purposeful in your life, central to who you are, part of your identity. And that doesn't mean pushing it away. It means
embracing it.
Hanging on to it.
Mm-hmm.
One of our undergraduates, Augustin Budeler, who I believe is here this evening, asked whether happiness is possible for everybody, or whether some people have to be unhappy in order for others to be happy. Like, is it comparative in some way? Augustin, I didn't read your quote exactly right. Let me say it, and I'm sure he put it this better. Can a society ever be restructured to ensure everyone's happiness, or must someone always be unsatisfied within the community to distinguish happiness from any other emotion?
Yeah.
Can you float it?
Business school, like, must we push people to...
This is one of our undergraduates.
Yeah. Sorry. I think it's a good question, right? I mean, we know that there are certain aspects of social comparison that affect our happiness, right? That it's, we think like, it's definitely not good to be under folks around us, whether that comes from your level of income, your level of beauty, whatever thing you're thinking of, when there's other people who are doing it better than you or have more of it than you, that feels crappy. And I think we have the intuition that the reverse feels good, and it might feel a little good, but not as good as the other way feels, right? And in fact, we see this borne out by some of the cross-cultural data that looks at things like income and happiness. Again, does having more money make you happier? If you're at really low poverty levels, yes, having more. So if you look cross-culturally, you do see this, but it's much flatter than you think. But a thing that I think affects happiness cross-culturally more than just sheer income is inequality. So if you're in a very wealthy nation, that's also a very unequal nation. On average, members of those populations will be less happy than a wealthy nation that's a little bit more equal, or even a not so wealthy nation where people are a little bit more even-keeled. But the interesting thing is it's not just that everybody at the bottom feels crappy and everybody at the top feels great. It's just inequality overall is making people feel kind of crappy. And so I think we have this intuition, which is a correct intuition, that like, oh, having less than others, that sucks. So, definitely I want to have a situation where I have more than other people. But the flip side isn't as true. I think what would be more true is if we could just kind of even things out, it might actually be better off.
You could lift everybody's boat a little bit.
Exactly. So much of so many of our intuitions are wrong, but I think another wrong intuition we have is just in general, we just assume everything's zero sum, right? Like everything's zero sum. My happiness, like I can't be happy if everyone around me is happy. It's gotta be this fight of this small pool of happiness. And so much more often we're increasing the pie, for sure with happiness. I mean, pro-social donation is huge with this, right? That like, you give money to some cause, you feel better, other people feel better, they do good stuff. There's just like more, like we increase the sheer amount of happiness that could go around when we do that. And I think that happens in so many domains. It's just our theory is that that's just not how it works. So I think we're scared of being under, which makes sense because that's psychologically painful. We assume that we need lots of tiers, but in fact, if we could get rid of a lot of the tiers, we'd be better off.
Okay. All right, so for the last question of the evening, I want to turn back to you. So, as many news outlets have reported, you are followed by the paparazzi, again, like all professors, right? That you're taking time out this year. You are not head of Silliman this year. You're not being a professor at Yale this year. You're still doing your podcast, but you're taking a sabbatical.
I'm a civilian, totally.
A civilian this year, yes, not an academic this year. To combat your own sense of burnout and exhaustion. And you don't seem to be alone in this. That is, we hear a lot of talk, particularly after the pandemic these days, about feeling burned out and exhausted. But it might come as somewhat of a surprise for folks here that Professor Happiness is feeling tired and kind
that
of
was definitely the angle snarky New York Times reporter wanted to go with it. Professor Happiness, burned out. None of it works. Everyone's a fraud.
That was the title, right? Yeah, that was
exactly.
the National Enquirer title.
Yeah.
So let's just spend the last part of this talking a little bit about this feeling of exhaustion and burnout and what we can do to kind of get out of it. And also just talk a little bit about your own experience with this and what you're doing to try to rejuvenate things a bit.
Yeah, so, in my case, what happened was I was running a college, I was running my lab, I was doing this stuff, I taught this class, it was enormous, it was like the logistical nightmare. I was called upon to do all these news things, I got this opportunity to do like an online class, I got an opportunity to do a podcast, and that was all happening, and then COVID hit, and then COVID was miserable for all of us and changed the sense of community. Running a residential college of 19-year-olds in the midst of a global pandemic, not awesome, I can promise all of you, but especially doing that at the same time that I was called upon to do more podcast episodes and more content because everybody was feeling like they needed some happiness, that was like a lot. And what I started noticing was a few things. One is I was exhausted a lot, like all the time. Not just like normal physical exhaustion, like you gotta sleep, like you sleep a great night's sleep and you're just still feeling spent. Second thing, and maybe most disturbing thing I noticed, was that I was getting really cynical. Like a student would ask for like a completely normal thing for a student to ask. Like in my residential college world, we often deal with like big income issues, like a student who doesn't have enough money for a dental, I need a root canal, and is there any way Yale can help me out with money for this? This was like things I love to do to help students in these situations, and now I'd get these emails like, oh, another damn root canal. Like just, another recommendation letter. Like, why do they always need recommendation letters? And that wasn't my normal attitude, but I was like, this is what, psychologists call depersonalization, right? Where it's not a person and I have empathy and I have compassion for their needs. It's like another thing on my plate, I can't even, right? And then there's a sense of what researchers call personal ineffectiveness, where it feels like even if I was doing my job the best way, I wouldn't be making an impact. And this, I think, was particular for me during COVID, where I had this community that I loved that got sent all over the place. Now we're running a college, but we can't really have classes in person. It just felt like none of this is working, right? And I was noticing all these things. And I'm doing podcast episodes about burnout. And I was like, those 3 symptoms sound very familiar. Like, yeah, clicking in. And so I said, I have to practice what I preach. First of all, I have the incredible privilege that many of us have in academia where we have these sabbatical things where we can take a year to take a break. I think all jobs should have this. So I had the privilege of doing that. But I was like, if I don't start, and I know the data, right? If I don't start addressing this is not going to get better spontaneously. I'm not going to feel less cynical. I'm not going to feel less burnt out. I need to really take a moment to kind of reevaluate it. And so I did it. It was not an easy decision. Leaving my residential college again at the end of COVID felt awful. It felt like I was really hurting the community, but I was like, I can't do my job well unless I'm kind of taking care of myself. And so that was my path, and I think it was kind of a little clickbait, but I think it was not the happiness professor so burnt out. It was happiness professor, like so many of us, seeing the signs of burnout, but because she has this training, knew what to do, and knew to sometimes it means a hard decision to change things around, to fix things up.
So for folks who can't take a sabbatical to figure things out, what would you recommend?
Yeah, I mean, I think it doesn't get better unless you do something. And the form of what you do is probably going to be pretty individual based on what's happening with your job, what happens with whatever. One is that you have to recapture that sense of effectiveness. And it might not be in your job, right? This might mean, it sounds like goofy to say, like you might need a hobby, but like you might need something else in which you're feeling growth and effectiveness. And that means taking your identity back from this other thing that might be burning you out. A lot of the work of burnout is a narrative work, where sometimes we feel burned out. Sometimes people think that the burnout are like, the people who are not engaged. But if you look at studies of teachers and studies of frontline workers, it's not the ones who are like blowing off their job that get burned out. It's the ones who really intensely feel the identity, really care about it passionately. And you might need to step back from that caring. Not don't care, but step back from your identity, that your whole identity is about that thing. You're also like a mother, a father, a daughter, a spouse, a friend, right? Can you kind of engage those identities a little bit more? Sometimes that's a sort of simple quirk. And then finally, I think another hack you can do, especially if you can't leave your position, is to really try a little of what my colleague Amy Resninsky at Yale School of Management calls job crafting, right? Which is, ultimately what are my core values and how can I build that in a little bit more to what I do? Sometimes burnout is like a misalignment with what you thought you were doing, and you gotta kind of tweak it back. But those can be powerful ways to do it. But also highly recommend year off, civilian life. So good. You can do it. But given that not everyone can. But I think the key is that you cannot notice those symptoms and pretend it's just gonna be fine. They don't actually get better. And I think we need to kind of explain that scientifically a lot so that more people who need to take action can take action. It can get better, but you gotta do something about it. And this gets back to the point we talked about before of happiness is not having any negative emotions. Those burnout emotions were negative. When I was noticing my emotional reaction to these caring students who I cared about and admitting that to you all is awful to notice that. But I was like, that is a really glaring, blaring signal. It's like when your microwave is beeping at you really strongly that something's gonna burn, it's a fire alarm going off in your emotional system. And if you don't listen to it, bad things are gonna happen. So if you're feeling it, listen to it, try other strategies to get around it, but don't just not paying attention. It doesn't work.
So I think you have done a better job than any academic I know at crafting your job to fit your unique talents and strengths, which is amazing. All of us who do research and hear you talk about it are happy to have it talked about better than we could usually talk about it. But I will also note that your sabbatical to take time off and get a break from some of this may not be going as effectively on this trip as at other times. Because I will note that Dr. Santos needs to be somewhere else shortly after this. So she's going to be racing out of here to another thing so that she can also give another talk tomorrow, and I think one on Saturday too. So we're going to let Laurie go here promptly. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much for what you do. And keep up the great work. Keep up the great work. And please, all of you, join us on February 1st down at the Gleacher Center for Neela Saldana, who will be our next Think Better speaker. Thanks, everybody, for coming tonight.